Previously on Wrongly Accused. In January 1950, Timothy Evans was sentenced to death by hanging for the murder of his baby daughter, Geraldine. Police were also convinced he had murdered his wife, Beryl. This was supported by the fact he had walked into a police station to openly confess to the crime. But in the months that followed his death, a campaign was mounted by his mother, Thomasina, to prove his innocence. At the heart of pretty much every wrongful conviction case that I've worked on and that I know about through history, there has usually been one strong woman, usually the person's mum, who is prepared to keep on campaigning. Now, that's not to say that they do so because it's their son and they would believe them regardless, because all of the women that I know of, all of the mothers that I know of who have campaigned really strongly on behalf of their sons have all been intelligent realists with a strong sense of justice who would not ever campaign on behalf of somebody that they thought was guilty, even if it was their son. I've had mums say to me about their sons, I would go and visit him in prison. I could never not visit him in prison. Doesn't matter what he'd done. If he'd done something awful, I would still visit him in prison. But there's absolutely no way that I could campaign for him if I thought he was guilty. So they're not blinded simply because it's their sons. But it takes, I think, a mother's love for them to continue with what is the most awful struggle of their entire lives to get justice, because as soon as that guilty conviction is in, it is horrendously difficult to get it overturned, even if somebody's innocent. During Timothy Evans' trial, the prosecution had called on his landlord at 10 Rillington Place to give evidence. John Christie would put on a display in the witness box that left the jury in no doubt as to Evans' guilt. But a chilling truth was soon to emerge about John Christie, that far from being an upstanding citizen, he was in fact a serial killer, a man whose entire psyche was engineered to deceive and kill. Christie's campaign of murder would span the years between 1943 and 1953, when as many as 8 women and children died at his hands.
Wrongly Accused, Dr. Richard Badcock, take 1.
It's very easy to describe Christie as a psychopath because he clearly had no conscience or moral compass. Christie was a schemer and a manipulator. He saw an opportunity to have an experience with Beryl. So I think as soon as he saw the opportunity, he started planning the killing. The death of Beryl Evans was described as not being sadistic in any way. I think that's absolutely untrue. Again, the condition of her body has got his psychological fingerprints all over it. The disturbance of the clothing, the fact that she was strangled from behind. I think by that stage, Christie had already reached the stage that his ideal, possibly his only sexual satisfaction came from intercourse at the point of death. He might have had a bit of a go before, and he might have had another go afterwards. But for him, the pinnacle of experience was attempted sexual intercourse at the point of death of the victim.
And with his first victim, he was to establish a cruel pattern that would be repeated over the next decade, all beginning with luring the women back to 10 Rillington Place.
Wrongly Accused, Tim Tate, take 1.
Christie's first victim was a young munitions worker called Ruth Fürst. She was Austrian. She'd fled to this country just before the Second World War. And in the 1940s, she had supplemented her meagre wages by selling sex. He knew his wife Ethel was away, and he'd lured Ruth Fürst back to the flat at 10 Rillington Place, and he'd strangled her and raped her. And first he'd buried the body under the floorboards, and then he'd moved it to a shallow grave in the yard. His second victim was Maureen Eady, Christie met her at a local factory. She told him that she suffered from bronchitis. And Christie, again playing to this image that he had in the community as being the doc, said, "Oh, I've developed a new treatment for this. Would you like to come and try it?" Now, this new treatment was in fact nothing more than an over-the-counter remedy, but Christie lured Maureen back to the flat and he showed her a jar with this mixture in, and attached to the jar was a rubber hose and a face mask. He sat Maureen in the chair, fitted the mask over her face and went behind her, and while she couldn't see, he attached a second hose to the gas supply in the flat, and he gassed Maureen to unconsciousness. That made it easier for him to strangle and rape her.
The other necessary consequence of doing these things to other people is that you empty yourself of the things that make you human. And if you empty yourself of the things that make you human, the uncertainty, the mess, the complications, what you're left with is nothing. So then people will, some serial killers, for example, they will intensify their level of killing because it's that which makes them feel alive. Of course, if you get to the point where killing somebody is the only way that you can feel alive, then you're on a downward spiral.
Over the years, a further 6 other women were enticed back to 10 Rillington Place to be murdered by Christie, all the while he was living there with his wife Ethel. Many have questioned exactly what she knew about the deadly comings and goings at the house, and how she could have remained married to a man that many said she was deeply suspicious and afraid of. He represented to her, I suppose, respectability, because he had this charade, this sort of facade of respectability. He was described often as the best dressed man in the street, the person who was doing the most responsible job. And so for a woman who had no family and no support network of her own, very little money, no sense of protection or respectability, he must have represented all of that to her. And then along the way there must have been glimmers where she must have had clues that things were amiss, and I would imagine that those clues started with him visiting prostitutes and just a sense that there was something else was happening there. Him smelling of perfume, him coming home and her being suspicious about what he was doing, and then all of that developing into suddenly him having items that he couldn't account for, pieces of jewellery, things that he would have got from women that he'd been with and women that he'd murdered. And that must have been so mixed up for her, because she must have gone through stages of thinking, he's given me an item, he's given me something, he cares for me, he's showing his affection, and then the doubt creeping into thinking, where did he get that from? And how has he got that? And why are there these people coming into our home that he can't explain, that he's not able to account for? So all of that must have been this absolutely impending sense of dread and doom, that there was something wrong, that she couldn't really put her finger on, that she couldn't really explain, but she must have reached a stage of realisation. And I can only imagine that she didn't ever think that the danger really could be as close and as real and as horrific as it was. And she must have thought that the alternative was just too difficult to bear. That where would she go? Who would she stay with? She had nobody that she could live with. She had no friends or family that she could sort of suddenly go to. Nobody that would take her in. And she must have stayed in spite of all of those fears that were bubbling up around her and in her world, until she was scared of him and then he killed her. Following the murder of his Ethel, in the months that followed, Christie murdered 3 other women, concealing their remains within the confines of Rillington Place. Come the spring of 1953, the Notting Hill area of London was changing and was home to a thriving Afro-Caribbean community. This change infuriated the highly prejudiced Christie, who decided he no longer wanted to reside in the area.
Wrongly accused, Geoffrey Wansell, take one.
Christie is profoundly racist, and the fact that his area of Notting Hill is becoming increasingly popular among new black immigrants infuriates Christie. So he decides that he'll sublet his ground floor part of Rillington Place and leave. The top floor tenant in Rillington Place, a man called Beresford Brown, who's now allowed to use the kitchen in what was Christie's ground floor. Well, he goes into the kitchen and he decides he'd like to put a radio on the wall to listen to while he's making his supper. He tries to put a bracket into this thing that he thinks is a solid wall, which is in fact this wallpapered over alcove in the kitchen. It almost defies belief. He realises that he can't screw into anything because there isn't anything there. So he peels back the wallpaper and glimpses what it seems to him must be a body of a woman. And he peels it back a bit more, and there seems to be more than one woman. The police, of course, are called.
Then the police decided they should dig up the floorboards of Christie's flat in 10 Rillington Place, and under the floorboards they found the body of his own wife. And then, out in the yard, they dug up the soil and the ground, and they found 2 further bodies of young women. In total, that made 6 known victims.
Christie would prove himself to be a prolific serial killer, but unlike many murderers, he didn't choose to distance himself from his victims, instead keeping them close by, turning Rillington Place into a cemetery. But why did he do this?
I think you have to understand, for the people who have carried out these murders, they have no sense of shame or guilt or horror of what they've done. And so once that element has been removed, you then are into the other aspects of it, which are either keeping things from a trophy point of view, because the individuals derive some sort of pleasure from remembering what's happened, or from being close to that trigger for them of the satisfaction they got from it, or just simply completely practical reasons that if you've got to get rid of a body, then as soon as you step out from the privacy of home, of the space where it's taken place, you're going into areas of risk. You might be seen. Are you going to be heard? Is somebody going to witness you doing something, or carrying the body, or whatever it might be? So I think very often it's just simply from a very practical point of view that if everything is here, then you can control it. You can control who's coming in. You can control whether it's likely to be seen. If there is some aspect of it, you don't know whether if you bury a body somewhere else, of whether it's going to be discovered by somebody who's walking, or by animals disturbing the remains, or whatever it might be. So it's all about control, I think, about keeping the bodies close by.
Having discovered the remains of his victims, police launched a manhunt to track down John Christie. With his name and face published in all of the newspapers, Christie responded by attempting to take control of the narrative.
Wrongly accused, Mike Berry, take one.
Well, one of the interesting things that we know about him was he actually contacted a newspaper before he was arrested and said that he would hand himself in if they interviewed him, and he set up a meeting with the journalist, but unfortunately 2 policemen happened to be walking nearby, and this frightened him, so he didn't actually attend to the interview with the journalist. But it indicates he even when he wants to confess, he wants to do it in a big way. He wants to be the hero of his own downfall in a way.
He starts sleeping rough. He pawns his watch. But on the 31st of March 1953, he's accosted by an officer, a constable, on the embankment in Putney, and says to Christie, "You're John Reginald Christie, aren't you?" And Christie denies it, and then quite quickly acknowledges that he is, and he's arrested. Christie is interrogated repeatedly, and he confesses to 7 murders, the 6 bodies, and Beryl Evans. But he never confesses to the murder of Geraldine Evans.
Why didn't he confess to killing baby Geraldine? Perhaps in his own twisted world, killing vulnerable women was acceptable, whereas killing a baby was something that he thought was just really, without defence.
Those confessions posed an enormous problem, both for the police and for the government. They clearly suggested that an innocent man had been sent to the gallows and had lost his life while the real killer was left free. The government ordered an urgent, judge-led inquiry. That inquiry was extraordinary. When you read the papers, you see the extraordinary legal gymnastics by which the judge persuades himself that Christie's confessions should be discounted. When Christie came to trial, there was to be no mention of Beryl and Geraldine Evans or of Tim Evans. The prosecution said, well, there are 6 definite victims, but we will only proceed to prosecute him for 1, his wife. And that's what happened. Christie was tried for the murder of his wife.
Christie's trial begins in June 1953. It's a sensation. After all, he's confessed to 7 murders. But nevertheless, he pleads not guilty by reason of insanity. I can't remember what happened. I don't remember what I did. It was nothing really to do with me. It was just an aberration.
His own barrister described him as mad as a March hare. And had that succeeded, had that defence succeeded, it would have enabled Christie to escape the death sentence. The jury didn't buy it. Very quickly they returned a guilty verdict, and Christie was taken to prison and very shortly afterwards was led into the execution shed. The hangman who put the noose round his neck and dropped him to his death was the same man who 3 years earlier had executed Tim Evans, Albert Pierpoint.
Christie being hung, he would see as a massive injustice. He would see that, if only these stupid people would look at it the right way, they would see in straight away that he was the proper victim in this scenario, not these stupid women who'd sort of thrown themselves in his path and then somehow mysteriously died. So I think he would have a clearer, more straightforward view of why he shouldn't be hung.
The case then became a cause célèbre in the press and in Parliament. There were calls for Tim Evans' conviction to be re-examined, to be reopened, and once again the government ordered an official inquiry. And like the first one, this inquiry twisted itself into legal pretzels to try and minimise the political fallout of what had been done.
The inquiry chaired by Sir Daniel Brabin was a whitewash. Astonishingly, it concluded that Evans had murdered wife Beryl, but not baby Geraldine, in direct contrast to the evidence used at trial to condemn Timothy.
David Westlake, take 1.
what you have to remember is that from 1950 onwards, the world believed Tim to be a double murderer. And clearly, from the family's point of view, they closed ranks. I mean, regardless of what people might have thought of the family's perception was that if people knew about it, they would be ostracised and, treated with contempt, disdain, I don't know, anger. So it was never really spoken about. And even when the free pardon came through, because of the nature of the conclusion of the Brabin report, there was still doubt. And I think this is why, over the years, Mum has fought so hard to get the conviction quashed.
For many years, it's just simply left as a really grubby domestic murder that nobody is really interested in. It takes the interest of Ludovic Kennedy, an author, an investigative journalist who writes a book and then succeeds in getting a film made about the same case. It takes all of that to really shift focus onto it becoming really the first kind of murder mystery in terms of wrongful convictions. And then it captures the public imagination. And then suddenly everyone's thinking, well, hang on a minute. At the really most basic level, could we really have two murderers living in this same house at the same time? And then the public's attention is grabbed. But for a very long time, Timothy Evans' mother was in the wilderness on her own, trying to get justice for her son.
Following further pressure from the family and public outrage, in 1966, Home Secretary Roy Jenkins recommended a royal pardon, still falling far short of quashing the conviction and announcing Timothy Evans as an innocent man. This meant a shadow of guilt continued to be cast across the entire Evans family.
David Westlake, take one.
Mum wanted the conviction fully quashed, whether that was simply by ministerial direction or judicial direction or through a retrial or rehearing. We didn't really care. In 72 years, nobody from police, government, anybody else has actually ever issued a formal apology to the family. Because I was such a precocious kid, I started asking questions that I think they both felt kind of, unable or unwilling to answer. Obviously, the nature of the murders, the sexual content, all the rest of it. So Dad suggested to Mum that they let me have the book 10 Rillington Place to read. So that's what happened, and I read through that in a couple of days. So, that's a hard read for an adult, never mind an 11-year-old kid. Long after I'd kind of first learnt about this, when I first started going out with young ladies, I remember my dad taking me aside one night and saying, "Look, son, this thing about Tim, you need to bear in mind that if you ever get involved with a girl that you want to marry, I'm going to insist that you tell her about Tim's case before you get engaged, because I don't want a girl coming into this family and finding out after she's a part of it about this horror in our family's history." So, and as I say, that was long after the royal pardon had been granted. So even at that stage, it was still felt within the family as though it was something to be ashamed of, when clearly it wasn't. And that shame, I think, still sits with the family. I think Mum still feels some shame about it, despite everything that she's done.
The fact that Timothy Evans has never been declared innocent of the murders of Beryl and Geraldine means that even to this day, his family continue to carry the burden of his wrongful conviction and continue to fight to have his name cleared. This remains Timothy's sister Mary's wish.
That's Tim, when he was about 19 years old. I just wish he was still here. Silly, really, he'd be 98. I would just like his name cleared. As I say, he was just a lovable little boy.
In the years following Timothy's conviction, historians and psychologists have examined the circumstances surrounding Timothy's confessions to understand why they were made and what lessons can be learned from how the police and the prosecution utilised them.
At least 2 separate forensic analyses have been done on the language of the statements, and both say that the Notting Hill statements were written in high register or police register language and couldn't possibly have been Tim's own words. So there's clear evidence that pressure was put on Tim during the questioning and that effectively words were put into Tim's mouth.
As well as exposing fatal flaws in the police investigation, subsequent analysis has revealed major failings in the entire investigation. Perhaps most damning of all was the fact that Detective Inspector Jennings buried evidence provided by workmen who had been replacing rotten floorboards at Rillington Place.
4 workmen were interviewed by the police initially about dates and times when they were at Rillington Place, what they saw when they handed over floorboards to Christie. And it was those floorboards that were subsequently found to be covering Beryl and Geraldine's body in the outhouse. The police weren't happy with the timings because the timings would have proved that Tim was innocent had their timings been correct. So 2 of the workmen were called back in and were more or less forced by Jennings to change their statements and change the times. The one crucial timesheet, which was that of Willis, the plasterer, which could have proved Tim's innocence, was never presented in court, was never discovered afterwards, and when somebody did a search of the company who was called Larter, their personnel records, that timesheet was the only one missing from Larter's records for the period from 1948 to 1953. So the clear implication is that Jennings suppressed it, hid it.
After discovering the bodies of Beryl and Geraldine in the wash house, it would be logical to expect the police to have searched that adjoining garden. A garden which contained 2 shallow graves and a fence propped up by a human thigh bone that belonged to victim Muriel Eady.
On the day of one of the searches, according to Ludovic Kennedy, Christie's dog Judy had actually dug up the skull of Muriel Eady, which he then placed in a dustbin, or a broken dustbin in the garden, prior to disposing of it in an abandoned house or burnt out house. That skull was in the dustbin on the day of the second search that the police carried out at Rillington Place. So major oversight there.
Wrongly accused Paul Bethel. Take 2.
Had the police done a more thorough search and had the victims been found, the other victims, would that have made any difference in relation to the outcome for Timothy? In other words, might he not have been hanged? One would like to think if the police had come across the other victims that a much larger, obviously, investigation would have taken place. It would have been quite a dramatic event to find all these victims, and that might have changed the course of the investigation, and perhaps Timothy might have been believed and they might have realised exactly what had gone on in Rillington Place.
As regards crime scene investigation, it is very easy to look at an historical murder investigation through a modern lens. In the 1940s and 50s, police forensics were in their infancy, and I'm interested to discover what techniques exist today that may have changed the course of the inquiry.
Hi, Katrine. Hi. So we've come to this area here because this ground is quite similar to the garden at Rillington Place, where we can see that from photographs, and it's quite a similar sort of space. So we know that eventually in the case they found 2 bodies which were in shallow graves in the garden. So if we were looking for bodies today in this kind of area, what sort of techniques would we use?
So from a forensic perspective, if there's an allegation of bodies having been buried in an area, we wouldn't go in with a big bulldozer and spades and try and destroy the ground. We would use these non-invasive techniques as Katrine is about to demonstrate.
So Katrine, can you explain then, what does the kit do?
Sure. So that's a ground penetrating radar. What most people probably know it as is on airports to navigate planes around. And it's based on the same technology, basically, just so we're not scanning the skies, but the ground, finding objects. Yeah.
If I want to bury a body, then I remove some of the earth
exactly.
in order to place the body in there, and then put the earth back in, and it all gets mixed up, and it's that mixed up area that this machine can essentially differentiate from other areas which have not been disturbed.
Exactly, yes,
Right.
that's basically it. So if you scan a whole area, you will get some background data, and then you will be able to see, okay, there's a patch which looks very different to the rest of the garden,
Yeah.
or the area we have scanned, and then that's definitely a good place to bring in the diggers there and say, target this area first before digging up the whole garden.
I mean, in terms of forensic recovery then, once we've identified that area, we can now start to focus in on recovering the material from it in a very methodical way, right? So we can start to peel away the layers. We can then start to reconstruct how that body was placed in a space, what other things were entwined with it. There might be other trace material from the attacker that's been left potentially in the gravesite. So it's a very methodical recovery, but this technology helps us to improve that methodology, I guess.
Could you give us a demonstration?
Yeah,
then?
sure, no problem. Love to. So as I push this along, the wheel triggers and sends an electromagnetic pulse into the ground. That one is being reflected again, and then we can see objects in the ground. Okay. What we can see is that we're having small little diffractions. Those are showing us that there's point sources in the ground, for example, rocks, boulders, or objects in the ground buried. So what we would do is we would take parallel survey lines, half-meter spaced, say, and then we put them all together, process them neatly, put them in a 3D cube, and then you can look at the slices, the vertical slices of the profile separately, or you could also horizontally slice the data to look at it how it looks like kind of a cake, I would describe it as. Yeah.
So it's almost like driving a shaft into the ground so that you can go down and see against the layers of the earth as you travel towards the core, effectively.
Yeah.
Down to a depth of up to 4 meters.
Yes, exactly.
That's amazing.
So Jo, have you been to crime scenes where this kind of technology has been used?
Yes, this is a very commonly used method, especially when you've got clandestine graves or areas that you want to scan in great detail very quickly.
So if we'd used this kit, or if we'd had this kit available then at the time of the murders in Rillington Place, could that have changed the outcome, do you think, of the case?
Yes, because it would have been employed very effectively in a small back garden, and it would have scanned that area very quickly, and the bodies would have been found very easily. And obviously that didn't happen.
In every wrongful murder conviction I have ever examined, there has always been what I describe as a tipping point. This is the moment where the police investigation veered off course, resulting in an innocent party being accused of a crime they did not commit. In many instances, this involves forensic evidence being misinterpreted or missed entirely. I'm joined on a specially constructed set by forensic scientist Jo Millington and retired Detective Chief Inspector Paul Bethel. We are about to examine how rooms and grounds of Rillington Place contained vital evidence that the police missed, evidence that would have condemned John Christie as a killer and saved Timothy Evans' life. We begin by looking at the murders of baby Geraldine and her mother. For us, I think in this case, it's about Beryl and her vulnerability. Jo, you've been to hundreds of crime scenes, of murder scenes. Do you find often that women are put in this very vulnerable position?
I mean, it's unfortunate that there's a disproportionately high number of women in domestic situations that are victim to violence. And this really is no different. So it is a domestic setting for all intents and purposes, and the police investigated it in that manner.
But would they have looked at this room?
So in the context of the investigation of the deaths of Beryl and Geraldine, they would have given this room a cursory examination, but in actual fact, in the context of the greater picture, this wasn't the focal point. This was the garden.
And it was the garden where the bodies were found, so we should go and have a look there.
Yes.
So this is the garden now of Rillington Place, and this really has become a house of horrors, hasn't it? We've seen that Christie brought Beryl's body out and put her into the washroom. Why would he keep the bodies so close to him?
10 Rillington Place and the whole area, it had been badly bombed during the war. And, you know, some might say, well, excellent opportunity for him to conceal bodies in the rubble, as it were, around him. But another thing that used to happen in those buildings is people would rummage and forage for timber and wood, because of course they had no fuel in those days after the war. And of course they were a playground for children. So there was always that risk that had he deposited the bodies there, that they could be possibly found. I think that might have been a consideration of his. He could have felt comfort. He could have had pleasure, some sort of sadistic pleasure out of keeping the bodies there. And we know he was a psychopath, so, you know, who knows what he's thinking.
So, Joe, when they found the bodies of Geraldine, there were already 2 other women buried in this garden at that stage. If they'd found those bodies too, then we wouldn't be talking about this case now 70 years later, would we?
That's absolutely right. So during the original investigation, they wouldn't necessarily have examined the garden, but years later, when that examination was necessary, they would have scraped away the earth in order to reveal the bodies that had been essentially placed into shallow graves.
So when they find the bodies of Beryl and Geraldine in that wash house, Timothy's fate is sealed.
Yes, because they have a confession from an individual and the findings completely corroborate that account. And so in their minds, it was essentially the end of the road in terms of their investigation.
So we've got Joe's perspective from the forensic angle then, but from a policing perspective, Paul, would Timothy Evans have hanged?
If those victims' bodies had been found at the initial search, then I feel it is very unlikely that Timothy would have hanged.
So when you look at this garden and this house, then there are a raft of missed opportunities here, aren't there? And that ultimately cost a man his life. Thank you very much. Thanks. I'm going to meet David Westlake, who is Timothy Evans' nephew, and I really want to find out, as a family, what it's been like for them and whether this crime and this conviction still really haunts them.
The catalogue of missed opportunities to prove Timothy's innocence and the continued refusal by the Home Office to quash Timothy Evans' conviction means that this case continues to fascinate the public more than 70 years on. But what impact does it continue to have on the Evans family?
David and Louise interview.
So David, it's 72 years then since Tim was hanged.
Yep.
There's so much attention on the case over those years in so many different ways. So what has that done for you as a family then, trying to deal with getting justice over the years?
I mean, it's affected the whole family. You know, for most of my life, in the public view, Tim remains guilty. And even as a kid, I mean, I think the reason that, you know, I wasn't told about Tim in the early days was partly because I was too young, but also there was an element of shame within the family about it. You know, the world thought Tim was guilty, so my family were the family of a double murderer, technically, in the eyes of the rest of the world.
So what would now, for you, what would properly put this to bed for you and your mum?
I think the only thing from the family point of view would be a full quashing of the conviction, either that or a retrial. But I mean, I think the establishment will not allow that to happen, because there's too much stuff in there that they would prefer remain hidden, I think.
That's terribly sad, isn't it? That's
I have
really
to
sad.
say an apology from somebody might help, but you know, that's unlikely to happen. But it still wouldn't actually deal with the fundamental issue. The failure of the police, the failure of the prosecution, the failure of the defence, the whole series of errors and omissions that occurred actually resulted in the death of 4 more innocent women. Now that ultimately is down to the hands of Christie, but it wouldn't have happened if it had not been for a failure in the British justice system. So there, as far as I'm concerned, they've got the blood of 4 innocent victims on their hands, and I think they're aware of that. They can't bring themselves to admit that they got it completely wrong, and as a result, Christie was left to run free for another 3 years. So, you know, for me, that can be the only reason, I think, why they don't want to take this any further.
How sad.
Perhaps it's one of the ironies of British justice, but when Timothy Evans' clear innocence is confirmed that he did not kill either Beryl or Geraldine, they thought it was not worth the expense to go back and to reconstruct the case and to issue a proper quashing of the conviction. It is a tragedy, and in many ways it's deeply unsatisfactory, but nevertheless, we all know that Timothy Evans was innocent.
Capital punishment in the end was suspended in 1964, and actually capital punishment was taken off the statute books in 1969. Many would argue as a result of the Timothy Evans case and similar cases that happened in the 1950s.
What does this grim, miserable case teach us? I mean, is it just a throwback to a past that we only remember dimly now, a past in which police routinely railroaded suspects into prison, or worse, to the gallows, in which the prosecution system, the court system, was slow-moving, archaic, and sometimes, frankly, corrupt? Well, yes, it is that. But it's also a reminder that there is enormous inbuilt opposition within our systems, within the police, the criminal justice system, and within government, to rectifying cases of miscarriage of justice, even in cases where, like Tim Evans, the wrongly accused has been executed for a crime he didn't commit.
Timothy's wrongful execution continues to reverberate around the world and see lawyers and campaigners challenge the death penalty where it exists in other countries.
We know Tim's case has a lasting legacy in the sense that there are British barristers who are going to America to argue death row cases and get the death penalty overturned. I know of at least two barristers who have gone on record on TV saying that they actually quote Tim's case in their application to get the death penalty stopped in specific cases. So Tim's case has a lasting legacy in that sense. But from my point of view, the more important reason for getting those failings in the system out there are not so much to help the family and Tim, although clearly it would do that, but we know that since Tim's wrongful execution, I did some research, I think six years ago, that there have been at least 55 cases where if the death penalty had not been abolished, there are 55 capital cases at least where people have been wrongly found guilty and would have hanged had it not been for the abolition of the death penalty. So whatever lessons could have been learnt from Tim's case clearly haven't been, and people are still being wrongly convicted. If the death penalty was still in place, they would be wrongly executed. And you know, how the Court of Appeal can argue that therefore it's not in the public interest to retry Tim's case, I just don't understand, because this stuff needs to be aired, and not only does it need to be aired, the issues need to be addressed within the system. And I guess you will never stop miscarriages happening again, but I mean, certainly checks and balances should be put in place to minimise the possibility of that happening. And Tim's case provides all the lessons, and nobody wants to learn them, it seems.
The final words must go to Timothy's sister Mary, who continues to remember the toll the case took on her mother, Thomasina.
I always thought the light had gone out of her eyes. We never discussed Tim after that.
An entire family and justice system failed by the wrongful execution of an innocent man.
70 years on, this case is an enduring mystery. The monster Christie eventually confessed to killing so many, but not before Timothy Evans had hanged. His hanging is a stark reminder the gallows offer no hope of reprieve to innocent people convicted of murder.